Good afternoon, oder guten Mittag. The Geopolitics of AI was the title of a JP Morgan publication last week. Artificial intelligence is turning into a geopolitical battlefield with several actors in the focus. In North America, the Magnificent Seven are investing more than 600 billion per year into infrastructure. In China, more than 500 users now use GenAI every week, mostly building on domestic ecosystems and domestic infrastructure. In the Middle East, sovereign wealth funds are leveraging energy abundancy to play an important role also in AI infrastructure. Where do we stand here in Europe? What is Europe's edge in the global AI race? It's a tricky question, but with this panel, we'll for sure be able to answer it. I'm very honored to welcome today with us Jens Spahn, Chairman of the CDU-CSU Parliamentary Group im Deutschen Bundestag, Jeannette Fürstenberg, Head of Europe at Catalyst, General Catalyst, one of the leading PE funds in the world, Illek, CFO at Deutsche Telekom, and Annika from Mutius, the founder and CEO of Empion, a Berlin-based startup which is using AI to modernize recruiting, and according to Forbes, one of the top 30 tech leaders under 30. My name is Lorenz. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey, and I'm very honored to moderate this panel here today. Let's start with a discussion on where we stand today. I mean, there are many articles around AI investment bubble, around the LLMs, all the big investments. But at the end of the day, it will be about creating value for the shareholders, creating sustainable, profitable growth. Christian, from a CFO's perspective, what have you seen in terms of digital dividend being earned in recent years and now more recently around GenAI? And what is potentially also Deutsche Telekom's view on it?
Look, we're using AI for two different reasons. One is obviously for internal use. So our strategy is we're building on superior networks, bringing superior customer experience, and then superior returns. But AI will accelerate this, what we call flywheel, how we call it. And the second one is we're actually considering to establish a second leg beyond our core business, which obviously is AI gigafactories. But therefore, we're considering to build these things up. On the other hand, we need to find demand. And I think demand means commitment, not only build it up and then we'll see how it goes. So these are the two reasons.
Annika, when we move from the global leader in telco to an ambitious startup, and you did your PhD in mathematics, then you worked 4 or 5 years in Silicon Valley, and you know sort of both sides of the Atlantic. Where do we stand here in Europe with respect to AI and making AI work?
I think it's very hard to very generically answer the question because AI has so many different dimensions over models to data to infrastructure and all of this. And I think the question is rather where our core competencies are, because I mean there are different investment hypotheses. Brain also is also often one of those, but basically it's about focusing on what we can do and not necessarily on everything. So I think there are parts in the race that are pretty far, especially in the US, but also in China. But there are other areas where I think we still have a great chance, and I think we have to focus on those.
Jeannette, you wrote in your book, Wie gut wir sind, zeigt sich in Krisenzeiten ein Weckruf, about sort of the need for us to act, maybe bringing back some of the Gründergeist spirit. Where are we at our best if it comes to Gen AI in Europe?
I'd love to take a step back and maybe frame why this is different and why it's so important. I feel like over the past 15 years, we have outsourced our physical supply chain to China and our technology supply chain to the US, and that essentially led to a GDP gap of 10 trillion between Europe and the US. And the question is, how do we go and anchor that back in Europe, especially in the context of AI? I feel like right now there's a lot of debate as to what we need to pack for the train that is leaving, but we need to activate in a very strategic and fundamental way in order for our economy not to get eroded. I think that is probably the core anchor point. And the reason I wrote that book is because there are a lot of strategic levers we can pull in Europe with regards to innovating in AI, but also adopting AI at scale. And I think there are two things that are required. One is a shift in mindset. I fundamentally believe the future doesn't just happen, but the future is being built and is being created every day by founders like you and many others that I work with very closely. And what I see there is that there's a lot of activation energy, there's a lot of muscle, and there's also increasing amounts of capital going into these companies to get them to scale. We're personally invested in the two out of the largest European AI companies. One is Mistral, the other is Helsing. And these are very fundamental building blocks in making sure Europe can activate incredible deterrence, but also incredible sort of AI infrastructure. And so when we go back to the question of what else is needed outside of capital and outside of a mindset, then it comes down to talent. We have amazing talent on the continent, but we have scaled operators that are European that are currently in the US, and those need to be relocated. It's an effort we are actively undertaking as a firm, but we see more and more startups really becoming magnetic to key talent that currently resides in Tesla, that resides in DeepMind, that resides in Meta, and all these people want to come back and build for European sovereignty. And that is a key ingredient we now need to reinforce, and it comes down to all of us, and I think this panel is actually a great subset of stakeholders that is required to get this off the ground, because we need policy, we need founders, and we need industry and capital to really collaborate in a very substantial way.
Yesterday, Henry Kravitz was here, and he also mentioned the lack of a unified European capital market as one of the reasons why there is some capital, but maybe not sufficient to really scale. What's your perspective? How realistic is it to come to a more European capital market?
Well, that's a discussion that has been going on for long. 10 years ago, I was Deputy Finance Minister in Germany, and we already had that discussion, and I think it's even 10 or 20 years longer ongoing. But nevertheless, there is a bigger chance to finally get some steps forward than there has been in the past. I will add something, but first of all, I would say when you take it with AI here in Europe, and image of, we always use trains, huh? So I would say we are not anymore on the platform waiting for a train. We are on a train, but it's not an express train. It's a regional train so far. So we have started, but we are by far not where we should be. And then it comes to financing, capital market. It's not just for AI companies, it's for all deep tech companies here in Europe and Germany. It's still not, besides KfW, for example, European Investment Bank, to get private capital, the amount is still not high enough that the ticket you can get here in Germany especially. It's Solvency II, it's regulation, and it's mindset again by those who take the decisions. And so, of course, the Capital Market Union would make a difference. And I would say, especially the Chancellor is very much committed. There's a newly started debate in Europe. There's a chance, and we need to solve, take the link to the savings union perhaps away, and that makes it easier, but then the capital market union. Second is, if you take the US, we need cheap energy. I mean, they are building capacities or take their old, even very old nuclear power plants on the grid again. So what we need is cheaper energy as well here in Europe in general and in Germany especially. That means more supply, not less. We are year by year we have less supply that is guaranteed. And the third thing is regulation. I mean, you can say whatever you want about the current administration in the US, but they do deregulate quickly and profoundly. And we are discussing for months now if the AI Act should be postponed, if it should be cancelled, if it should be as it is, just remain. And I would say I would prefer to postpone it at least for 5 years, perhaps just take it away and start new. But that all shows, yes, we have started to debate it, to take some steps forward, high-tech agenda here in Germany, gigafactories approach of the European Commission. There are first steps, but when it comes to the fundamentals, financing it, cheap energy and regulation, we are by far not where we should be.
Maybe taking the corporate view on regulation, would you go along with the idea to postpone the EU?
I would completely echo this, because just try it out first, and in case there's something going wrong, then fix it rather than to preempt everything and slow down the process. So from this perspective, give the industry, give people the opportunity to experiment, explore, and figure out what you can do with AI rather than to regulate up front and say what's all forbidden, because nobody knows what is the full potential of AI.
Now, I think so. Talk now about a few of the ingredients required to build AI, scale up AI, and advance in the race. When we look forward, where would we see particular European strength, maybe in terms of sectors and industries and levels of application? Maybe, Jeannette, from your view of where you're investing, you mentioned already 2 companies. Which areas are you investing into?
First of all, I think one observation that is interesting is that AI actually allows for European companies to go global and to capture the entirety of Europe much faster. And that comes down to the modularity of the stack and the instant translation into different languages, different cultures, etc. So what we are seeing is that across all different verticals and functions, so this could be all the way from HR to verticals like legal AI, for example, or accounting, we're seeing European companies getting built that are built in Europe, that are capturing mind share and market share within Europe fast, but then they're actually competing in the US. So they're starting to compete on superior products. They sometimes have faster growth rates. Companies like Libora are showing that, or also Paloa here out of Berlin. So we're seeing critical technologies into massive markets getting built out of Europe. That is an encouraging signal, because we need more of these companies to succeed, because that's ultimately where our tax dollars will depend on. And I think the reason the service sector is so critical is because we're essentially taking labor and we are morphing that into GPUs. So we're basically taking an existing job in Europe or elsewhere, and that job is being melted into an application, into compute clusters. And if that application and those compute clusters are not in Europe, but in the US, then we're essentially taking jobs from Europe into the US, right? And so that's going to widen the gap I just mentioned. So service sectors is one domain that we have a right to play. It's a global domain, but it's one that we see a lot of traction and promise behind. Second is the whole question of defense. It's the first time in the history that Europe is actually like ahead in terms of defense spend to the US, which we are now seeing a lot of US companies wanting to come into Europe. But we're seeing big AI champions being built out of Europe in the context of defense, and that is a huge opportunity. So if we're taking the spend that is going to unlock over the next 5 years and we're routing that towards European AI companies, then we're going to build not a German champion, but we're going to build a European champion, which is the first time that this is actually possible in that industry, which was previously constrained by nationalisms, if you will. So I think that's an important and very critical sector for us to lean on, and where we need the full involvement of the government and the full backing of unions to really weigh in and say, we are going to put full emphasis behind modern defense technology getting embedded into the procurement spend, ideally ring-fencing 10 or 20% of that just for modern defense technologies. And the third thing I will mention, that is actually an interesting convergence that is somewhat overlapping to defense, but actually much broader than that, and a really interesting domain that is playing into our strength, and that is manufacturing and industrials. It's a key domain where Europe has been leading for many, many years and decades. And now what's happening is that AI is actually cascading down from this more horizontal enterprise workflow level into physical systems. And these things need to be tightly synchronized and coupled to actually make a difference. And if they do, it could create a huge leverage in terms of product innovation and actual sort of new spark that is being set in these domains. To give you one concrete example, Siemens controls the largest subset of control and automation systems, right, which is embedded everywhere. Now think what AI will do if the right product innovation actually goes activates there. So that's one example I would like to give you. And we see a lot of companies getting built, in enabling existing incumbents, but also when it comes down to scaling critical subcomponents that are needed for an AI-first manufacturing world. And I think that's going to be a huge lever if we think about relocating parts of the supply chain that's been taken to China back into Europe and scaling that off the back of modern technologies. And I think robotics is one that is tightly coupled into that, where we are seeing a lot of interesting momentum out of Europe.
Anything to add from your perspective? I mean, you're partnering with NVIDIA, I think, among others, building the industrial cloud here in Germany. And I think if we listen to Jensen Huang, he is saying that after Gen AI, there's agentic AI, but the big next wave will be robotic AI, very much sort of going into the direction of manufacturing support, etc.
Look, if you have a midterm perspective on this one, I think it's necessary taking a look at what kind of workforce challenges we have in the next 10 years. I think we have to replace human labor by robotics, and therefore we need to focus on those things in order to basically keep the productivity up.
Yeah.
Well, then it comes, by the way, to regulation again. I would say the most important thing for us as an industrial country, if we want to remain one. Of course, it's to talk more about AI and quantum and whatever. We are talking a lot about combustion engines these days, which is right, but that's not enough for our future. But then I would say the most important thing for us as an economy right now is to increase productivity. We haven't had an increase of productivity for 7-8 years. At least, though we have as many people working as never before here in Germany, a bit declining, but still. And at the same time, productivity has not increased. And to see AI not just as something for your tools and application and managing your emails and whatever, that's a discussion we have too often, to use it to increase productivity. There are many, many startups, for example, that are cooperating with the industry in Germany, but then that comes regulation. For example, if you have a production process in a car plant and they use visual tools, and after 3, 4, 5 weeks, AI, just by taking the videos and seeing how it is all done, it gives you some ideas how you can increase productivity by 20 to 30%, just by watching the process and then give you some advice. In Germany, you have to ask the unions to use it. In Poland and Hungary, Romania, you don't have to. So we are already in a situation in the third year of a recession here in Germany that industry is investing outside of Germany, abroad, outside of Europe, but in the East Europe as well, automotive, for example. So by this tool AI, they increase in their plants in Romania by 20% productivity, and in Germany, the union says no, and it can't happen. On the long run, the union is hurting their own members, but on the short run, they are all afraid of taking just these visual records. So actually, that is a question of regulating, something we need to change. I've been advocating for this change for some months and years now. If there are people to support me, I'd be happy, because it's very difficult to overcome this, because people feel kind of watched, controlled. But if we want to have that increase, for example, we need to change that. Otherwise, productivity is growing elsewhere. And you can find many, many other sectors where it can. Or ambition. I mean, China says we want to have 1 million humanoids in, I don't know, 1 to 3 years or something in our fabrics, in our plants. That's, you set a goal, and then you do everything to reach it. At least we have one goal in our coalition agreement, that is to build the first energy fusion reactor of the world here in Germany. That's some kind of an ambition in that area, but we need more ambition in these other areas, like you said, robots, humanoids, to make the difference.
And I believe the potential is huge. There's a recent McKinsey study saying that globally, Gen AI can add between 2.6 to 4.4 trillion value per year to the global economy. And especially, as I think Jeannette, you said, not with sort of horizontal chat GPT co-pilot solutions, but really going vertically in there, transforming domain by domain. And Annika, you are building such a solution which sort of helps with a very specific business problem. And maybe you can tell us a little about the impact, what you are expecting, and how efficiency and effectiveness of the process will improve.
Maybe I can still add a few comments to the point before, because from my experience, when I lived in Silicon Valley, I realized a few elements that were just doing better than we are doing it here, but then there are also some that I think Europe is quite good at. Two elements are for me important. One is the huge topic of research transfer, and the other is the topic of application. When I moved to the Silicon Valley, it was just completely normal that people from MIT just moved over to Silicon Valley, just because that was totally in their mindsets. It's obvious that you do a PhD in science and then you found a company afterwards. And that's something, I mean, I know that from my own experience. I did my research transfer, but that was basically if you do math and then do a PhD, usually, you don't think about founding a company. That doesn't make sense, to be completely honest. And so it has to come to a point where you consider founding a company, and there the system is totally not in the right place, what we have in Europe, because we have wonderful research, but usually people don't have the idea. So either they study entrepreneurship or they do science, but usually it does not come together. So this is one of the major leverages behind actually making research reasonably for the application and economic business models. However, the other point is application. Because, and then it comes indirectly to regulation again, because we can talk a lot about capital provided to young companies, and I know it's not necessarily the early stage capital, but the late stage capital that is missing in the European Union. But however, it's also all about applying your business models, finding partners, customers such as Telekom to be working together. Because in the end, it's also about operating cash flow. And money comes usually if you grow and if you can show top-line growth. And so in the entire discussion around capital and providing capital to young companies, I think it's really important not to forget that it's actually about application, about short innovation cycles, making sure that you can improve your product together with the customers and providing a good experience. And that's something we can easily do theoretically in Germany, in Europe especially. But however, I still have to complain a little bit, even though I'm really happy that I came back and that I live here and found here a company. I couldn't think of a better job, to be honest. But the AI Act did already its part of it, because also to give there a little bit of an idea from my founder perspective, I'm not a fan of the AI Act at all. So I think we talked about this already. But it's not necessarily about regulating us as a developer. It's rather about regulating the applicants, which means if I'm selling my product to someone, a medium-sized company in, let's say, Stuttgart, they would be willing to apply technology. They would be willing to be innovative. But then they not necessarily do this because they are scared of the sanctions that they get in correspondence with the AI Act. And that's something we really need to cover. So we cannot prevent people who want to be innovative from being innovative just because of regulation. And then I'm still, happy to be here and to work here as a founder and all of this.
Thank you for real-life entrepreneurship.
There are also worse cases than this, but I mean... Yeah.
I think last year at the Berlin Global Dialogue, there was a meeting with President Macron, and out of this, the EU AI Champions Initiative started. And I think, Jeannette, you are chairing it, bringing together startups, established companies, etc. What are the unlocks you are discussing there, and maybe sort of also how can the different companies collaborate even closer together?
Yeah. So the key insight there was that Europe needs an ambition. We cannot lead with regulation. To your point, Jens, we need to lead with ambition. We have to frame what that ambition should look like. In my view, that should be 3 out of the 10 largest global technology companies should be European in 10 years' time, and I think we can achieve that if we play our cards correctly. And so that initiative was brought together by President Macron at the time with 14 European heads of states and Ursula von der Leyen, which we announced in February, and now combines over 25% of European industry. And these are all the leading innovators and adopters of AI. That's a combined market capitalization of 3 trillion in Europe alone. And now imagine, with everything we've been saying, innovators like you coming together with adopters to actually go make that possible, what you all just described, in terms of actual productivity harnessing through that technology and the diffusion of AI into these businesses to begin with, but then also co-creating new products together. Let me give you 2 concrete examples. One that came of that is Paloa and Teleperformance, a French and a German company, signed a $100 million deal to go and innovate in the context of customer success. unprecedented at that time when that was announced. Second thing that happened was ASML partnering with Mistral and saying, what does the actual distribution of AI look like in the context of industrial applications and value creation? Huge investment of 1.3 billion into a European company led by European champion. So I think these types of partnerships is something we must innovate and run it at scale. That's what this European AI Champions Initiative was founded for, and it's actually really accelerating. It's harnessing big partnerships. It's harnessing a lot of learning between innovators and adopters, and that is the purpose and the goal of the initiative.
You once said in a book you've written about moving toward a Europe of pioneers. I think where you said that few countries in Europe could spearhead change. We don't need to wait for all the 27, but if there are 5 or 10 countries which can go ahead, this sort of would be a faster, more agile, more successful Europe. Would Germany be ready, willing, and able of sort of driving a pioneering role around AI?
Well, by the way, one example for this Europe of pioneer is the Defense Union. Yeah. Actually, only 2-3 countries, Germany and France and some others, started. And within months, all wanted to be part of it. Once you start, perhaps not all of them, some opt out, but many want to join. What we started now in small, but would be one way to start something between Germany and France, especially these days, would be a big AI campus or university, and both sides give 1 billion per year to it or something to make a real difference. And you start with the 2 countries, and then you can try to get others to join, for example. And you could do this in other areas as well. What is new for Europe, and this not new in the last months, but in the last years, since the pandemic, actually. You know, if you wonder if you see the news yesterday with Volkswagen and chips.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought it was understood 5 years ago when the pandemic started that we have issues with supply chains, and that we should have more than just one to deliver crucial parts for a car, for example. And now you see it's again just one company in China. They are very much depending in an area where could be some others supplying them. And you wonder, is there anything learned? So it's about resilience again, and that counts for chips, and it counts for AI, of course, as well. And that brings us to a very difficult discussion, which is if it is chips now, or Huawei in our telecommunication network. I wonder sometimes with how much emotions we can discuss Palantir here in Germany, and no one is discussing Huawei in our telecommunication grid. But nevertheless, that's more or less hardware on the way to software. But if you take AI now, you might want to know actually who is getting the data and which algorithms are there and from which country or system it comes. And the question is, and that discussion is not new, but I heard it this morning in the trade discussion here as well, is will there be in the end 2 or more systems next to each other, a Chinese digital AI system and a US-centered one, or Europe somehow in between. But when it comes to these crucial parts, like chips, grid networks, whatever, energy networks, or when it comes to software, you might discuss this these days if you really want to have I'm not allowed to say Chinese, but parts and software from. I'm not in the government, so I can't say it. If you want this software, this parts in your crucial nets or cars. I mean, I don't know if it is true, but it is said that with Chinese cars on our streets and the cameras they have, and there's a possibility that they can see everything. So what if this car is parked by an employee in the garage of the Bundesnachrichtendienst? Have we ever discussed this? And what does that mean actually for our own security and resilience to have this software, these parts, these technologies from systems that might be different to our in our crucial systems or crucial all days utilities, And I think we need that discussion as well when it comes to AI.
But in a way, I think this kind of approach is why we're so slow. Because we're always debating what can go wrong, right? I believe we should make AI, at least from a company perspective, an attitude. Everyone should embrace it, and everyone should figure it out what is possible. And not even talking about business models. I'm just saying embracing it and then figure out what are the consequences rather than to discuss potential negative consequences without having started. And I think this is a typical German discussion that we're discussing about the negative consequences before we even started.
But it was not the negative consequences of AI. I'm very much in favor of AI. My question was, shouldn't we be able to do it ourselves more than on relying on perhaps other countries we wouldn't rather not rely on? I'm very much embracing the technology. The question is, who owns it?
But Jens, we don't have technology independence. We don't have servers, we don't have chips. Nothing is under control of Europe right now. So we're reliant either on the US or on Asia-Pacific vendors,
yeah,
right?
But the question is, do we want to change it or do we just take it as it is? And that brings me to Huawei again. Do we just say, Huawei is in our grids, perfect, fine, let's go on? Or do we say, like other countries in Europe did, no, let's change it, let's get it out? And I think we should, and we are slowly on the way to it. Of course, you're right. Right now, it is as you describe. Question is it the way it should be as it is today? And I would say no.
And how long does it take in order to get there?
It takes some time, but if you never start, you never get there.
But can we maybe make that specific? I think it's one of the most important debates to be had, because if we constantly keep saying, well, we don't have it, so we need to import it, then our GDP keeps shrinking. So we have to actively build. And like the interesting thing is, right now with AI, you have such a fundamental shift in technology where a lot of the key components are just getting built. Yeah. The supply chain is just getting built as we speak. And so what part of the supply chain can we actually claim and build here? For example, the chip architecture is changing. What does it imply? How could we actually play a role in the chip supply chain and nearshoring that in Europe? Because as you say, it is a critical key component. With ASML, we have one of the most critical parts of that supply chain already sitting in Europe. So I think that's one. The second thing is, on the infrastructure side, we need to lean on European providers just as much as we're leaning on American ones. And that's a question of mindset. That's a question of folks like you saying, you know what, if and where possible, I'm buying European technology providers, such as Annika's product, because that's going to make it easier for these companies to actually scale. And then folks like us come in and deploy billions in making these companies successful. So that's kind of where the whole flywheel activates. And I think to your point, Jens, that's where we really need the government to activate as well. Because if you think about sectors like energy that you mentioned or defense that I just mentioned, then this comes down to very large CapEx deployments that can be funded by folks like us, but they will only get funded if we have actual anchor agreements and the state as an anchor customer. And that's what we need. So we don't need state equity. Nobody wants state equity. You don't want that. None of the best companies want that because it's an adverse signal. Let's just make that very clear and log that for the record and for the books once and for all. What we need is you guys to come in and say, you know what, here's 10 billion to develop a hypersonic missile system. He has 10 billion to develop.
But for Europe and not for Germany, France, or Netherlands.
Yeah, but like we have to think European. We are not going to die on the German sword. We shouldn't.
No, that was my point.
That's the beauty. And my point is, you're right in saying that hasn't happened yet. And I think there are critical technologies. In the context of defense, do we need Patriot systems? Probably. Do we need F-35s? Probably. So let's procure these from the Americans. But let's look at all the rest of the stack that also needs to get built, from satellite observation all the way down to air missile defense, et cetera, et cetera. These are all companies, especially mass hardware defense systems, that are very critical in the orchestration between AI and physical systems that can be built in Europe. We have a supply chain, to your point on automotive that we just discussed prior to coming up here. If you take drone motors, these are the same motors that are actually being built for cars. So air conditioning in cars is actually this exact same motor structure that is used for drones. So let's take that infrastructure, let's take that innovation that exists in Europe and just scale it. And stop with this sort of defeatist mind of saying, oh my God, we don't have anything, we're just going to lean back and sort of have it happen to us. Because if we keep doing that, then our children will be living in a museum. And I don't want that.
But maybe at this point, maybe to Deutsche Telekom, you were the fastest purchasing process in our entire history for corporates, of course.
I actually have to say, you guys are great. And I see René sitting here, who's been my biggest ally building this. You were the Telekom CEO for how long? Yeah, exactly. And so you guys are amazing. You have that DNA. You kind of set it up at the time. We see the same thing. We see Telekom actually being an amazing partner to startups. And so we need folks like you to come out, beat the drums and say we need more of that. And we need to really all ignite and celebrate the wins. Talk about them.
But I find, because we had this free trade discussion this morning, and of course, it's a question of the right balance. If it was a perfect world, I would say free markets and who can do it best and most efficient should do it. But we see, with different reasons and different tools, the US and China are right now in the last years, and I don't think it will change tomorrow, are going a different path. So the question is how to react. Of course, in general, we keep on being a promoter for free trade, Mercosur, whatever, we do what is necessary, but then we need, and that needs a proper discussion and needs to be adapted and discussed actually currently, is we need to figure out what is crucial for us for sovereignty. I would say solar panels are not. You know, we had a big discussion here in Germany. We should have solar panel production back in Germany. Let's spend billions. And I would say no. We can produce energy without solar panels if needed for some years even. Yeah. That's a dependency I can live with. We are dependent on toys, children toys from China. That's a dependency I can live with. I don't need to spend billions to build up new toys factories in Europe. But then there are crucial areas, and we need to define them. And that is biotech, for example, military defense, tech for sure, AI. So we can discuss this. Chips you already can start and perhaps say there are different kind of chips. And so, but we need to have actually this kind of more differentiated debate when it comes to sovereignty and dependencies. Not every dependency is per se a problem, and especially we as Germany, so much relying on exports for our wealth, we should have a very differentiated approach, but still not just being blind to what's going on around us.
But how are we accelerating this debate? Because I think we will also need to come to a final conclusion, then having this North Star, which we then follow of building up the industry and the infrastructures, and maybe then also sort of accepting some of the trade-offs.
Well, for example, with the high-tech agenda of if you take Germany, of the current government, or if you take Europe, actually there is a definition of where we are focusing at as a government, which is AI, which is quantum, which is biotech. It is climate tech, but then again you need to go a bit deeper what you actually mean. So they are focusing, if they are always focusing on the right stuff, that is what needs to be discussed, but there is focus for where is governmental money spent. I would prefer a competitive approach, as you said, not building, for example, the first fusion reactor as a state company, but saying, let's do a competition. Who says who can build that reactor for how much money? Laser and magnetic for both arms, and that company that has the best plan gets the money. And we can do that in different areas, not all run by the state. But that has started to have this kind of concentration, but of course that it's a debate you need to have ongoing and to reshuffle and reshape because technology is evolving.
I like your finance point, and I'm wondering if I take a look at sort of how capital markets treat the European companies very much as cash cows in many cases, where there are high dividends being paid, high share buybacks coming. I mean, you need to also stem next to the dividends lots of sort of infrastructure investments, but then competing against players sort of who have so deep pockets because they can accumulate billions, hundreds of billions of losses over time. Is the sort of level playing field?
No, look, first of all, I think you're paying dividends or you're going for share buybacks if you have no better means to invest into the business. I think as long as you have better means to invest into the business, you will obviously make compromises on those. And I think if you take a look at our dividend yield, it's actually pretty low relative to our competitors. So the second point is, I think we're not. I think we don't have a bottleneck, which is capital. capital is sufficiently there. And especially those business models like AI business models are always created off balance sheet. So you don't take it on your balance sheet, you take capital from capital providers and then establish those business models. We've done that with our tower business. We're considering this with the AI Gigafactory. So I think there are constructs in order to do so. But at the end of the day, you're right. You have to earn money. And we're coming from a company which is willing to basically invest, take a look at fiber, over a period of 20 years before you see a return. So I will not see a return on the vast majority of fiber investments in my career anymore. But we know it's kind of preserving the terminal value of a company. So from this perspective, that shouldn't be a problem in order to have a long-term perspective if you have, and you said it earlier on, a long-term commitment. But the problem is if you're spending billions of money and then you don't have kind of take or pay contracts, and you are basically taking the whole investment risk. That is the problem. And I think this is why people are shying away, and this is why we need these kind of long-term commitments in order to invest into businesses which have payback times of more than 10 years.
Yeah, so you're actually shifting CapEx to OpEx, which would be the smart thing to do. And
exactly.
like then if you guys would say, hey, actually we need to digitize and take our whole administration AI native, which would make a bunch of sense, then you put a tender out that should specifically speak to that, and where then the likes of you can actually build the infrastructure in cohesion with folks like us, and that's how the whole flywheel, and that's why I keep coming back to the flywheel, it needs to get activated at that core. Because as soon as the big contracts are out, people start to build and people start to invest immediately.
Regarding AI, I agree, but there's one, and I have no solution, but it is worrying me for months and years now, this subsidy raise on chips and semiconductor. And then there come the companies. I mean, in our budget for the next 4 years, there's 20 billion subsidies just planning, but some of them already fixed. 20 billion in 4 years for subsidies for chip plants. And I say, why so much money? I had better ideas to do something with that. Then they say, of course, the companies say, well, if we go to South Korea, if we go to Taiwan, China, US, Italy, France, whoever, UK, they offer 2-digit billions. Yep. So if you don't offer it, we go. I'm not sure if this kind of subsidy raise that we are, and when does it end was my question. Are we going on like this for decades? Or is there any point where you just have prices on the market that are good enough to finance what you need, and everyone else is just stopping subsidizing it? And so far, I have not found a way out of this subsidized race we have in this area, but it's really billions we are all throwing on this all over the world. And that is makes no sense to me, actually.
But Jens, what we're looking for is something different.
Yeah.
We're not looking, especially when it comes to AI gigafactories, we're not looking for subsidies. We're looking for long-term commitments. And why we're looking for long-term commitments? Because it puts the public sector under pressure to actually utilize what they committed to. And this is how the flywheel starts.
100%.
Rather than to give us $1 billion here and then fire and forget. I think we have many of those examples.
But I need a way out for these chips.
But you know how you do it with the chips? You basically say, whoever builds me one gets the contract, and the price is X. And that's when people say, you know what? We'll go find the best people in the world, we bring them here, and we start building. Yeah, that's
most of the chips are not bought by the state, are they? So actually, of course, it's a question of how you organize it then. And then just with Volkswagen, I mean, it's a very current dramatic situation. You see actually where it can end. But then we are not the main customer as a state, and hopefully it will remain so for chips. But at the same time, everyone says we need to be sovereign, resilient. We need to have this here, and that is what we do now with billions. But of course, chips do have their developments. They are getting better and better. So the one plant you subsidized, it's not good enough in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and you need the next and the next and the next. So where does this end? For that, I still need a plan. If someone has one.
I think one example I can give you that's actually really interesting is we always talk about chips as though it's like one factory that's getting built and then the magic happens in there. It's actually a much more complex supply chain, and I think in general, and I like your framing on where does resiliency actually come from and what are the key IP elements we need to nearshore and own. Where can we not afford to rely on China, on the US? And so if we look at that in the context of chips, one key part of that comes down to high precision engineering tools, the tools that are actually needed to, for example, do the interconnect in data centers and stuff like that. I personally had a conversation last week with people who are currently in Taiwan who said, you know what, actually we see a huge opportunity in Europe. Can you help us land there? Because we think we can actually build something a lot more meaningful in that next generation that's needed for the interconnect, for the next data centers to be built. And that is smart. Let's bring these people back here. Let's understand what they need and then work from there and understand that this is a key component if it was nearshored here that would really give us critical IP and resilience in a key category, but it would also give us a huge potential growth vector in terms of economic value capture that can come from there. So for me, it always comes down to macro and micro kind of really interconnecting in a way that is strategic and long-term oriented in the way that we think and act.
Now we talked for quite a bit about what it takes to build the infrastructure, the capital, the regulatory framework, etc. There's one thing which is puzzling me. If we look at the results of companies, or we survey them across the world, you don't really see the digital dividend having been earned. Now, 15 years into digitization, productivity in many industries hasn't really improved so much. 3 years into Gen AI, we see that only 15 to 20% of AI use cases are really scaled fully in production action, and the rest is some proof of concept proliferation. So what can the companies, the founders, the investors do to really make sure that the technology is really applied, makes a change, and really helps to reinvent and rewire the business models?
Look, first of all, I would disagree with that. We looked into this. We have reduced our workforce in Europe by 40,000 people net by increasing revenues and EBITDA. And why is this coming? Where is this coming from? From digitization. Potentially not at the degree people hope for, but you see there's the digital dividend. And I think with AI, this will accelerate. It will definitely accelerate. And we need this, right? So for us, digitalization is a forcing mechanism to actually get leaner and leaner and leaner to provide our services with less people in order to stay profitable. So I wouldn't agree with your statement here.
And I think
but maybe then Telekom is a very good, Deutsche Telekom is a very positive example. When I'm in home and banking and insurance, and if we look there, what is the admin cost for an insurance policy? It has risen with inflation rate over the last 10 years. If we take a look what is the productivity per bank employee, it's also relatively the same. So I think there might be sectoral differences, but overall, I mean, we just published a survey yesterday, or a study in North America, that the tech investment went up by 8% CAGR per year over the last 5 years. Productivity or costs went only down by 2%. So there seems to be a gap between many of the investments being taken and the bottom line result arriving.
But I do think that's also a question of technological maturity. We see enterprises pausing for the right reasons on security and the whole question of data sensitivity. And I think that is getting solved right now at the tooling and infrastructure and application layer. And once these companies are getting more safe to use by the likes of you, we actually see the pipeline full. Yeah. So I do think people often, and that's I think is a quote by Bill Gates, not from me, that people underestimate the technology impact in the short term or in the long term. And so the question is, when we think about the long-term effects, they're going to be massive. And right now, we need to lean into the diffusion of AI as much as we can, and need to encourage that in any way possible, because of the labor shortage you rightfully mentioned, which is it's just so hard to hire great people. And how do we make sure that, and you spend so much time in the health sector, all these nurses are actually getting helped by an AI agent that can at least do the phone calls in a way more empathetic way, and in a way that actually gives them time to spend time with patients in person. Like, there's so much critical leverage we can apply in domains where we have key shortage, and I think it's also a question of communication. Right now, people are also scared to adopt AI. To your point on the whole sort of worker unions that are very much kind of pausing on, is this good or bad? I think they need to lean into that as a way for us to become a lot more productive based on what we have. I don't see people going out of jobs anytime soon, at least for the medium term. And then in the long term, we can now start thinking about reskilling, upskilling of people as we move along and really make sure employees become lifelong learners. I think something that we need to really lay the foundation for right now. But leaning into AI diffusion to the maximum degree is a leadership job to do, but it's also a question of market maturity meeting the leader's ambition to actually be ready to deploy. So I'd say the next 12 months, if I had to make a prediction, I think we're going to see a massive uptick just looking at the funnel of the companies we're invested in.
One thing is labor shortages, the other one is labor costs. And I don't know if I get the numbers right now, but the relation of the numbers is right more or less. We all know Ludwigshafen and the big energy-intensive company that is there. And they say for this, what they have in Ludwigshafen, it's, what was it, 50 million electricity costs, 700 million gas, and 5 billion labor costs.
Correct.
So if you increase productivity by 1%, the cost for electricity is more or less irrelevant. And we are right now in the German and European debate perhaps as well, but in the German debate for sure, very much focusing at energy costs, which are important, don't get me wrong, but labor costs, obviously in a country like ours, aging, and with a social security system as we have it, with 42 something just for social security, 42% contributions, we need to bring it down. And that is productivity, productivity, productivity. And if a country like Germany, with this living and social standard we have, has no increase of productivity for more than 7-8 years now, that's just brutal. Yes. I mean, the US has grown 16 times as much as Germany in the last 5 years. 16 times. That is just as brutal as it can get, and I'm not sure, sometimes the mood in Germany is worse than the facts. I would say when it comes to industry and productivity, the facts are worse than the mood. And it is already bad, the mood. So actually, we really have an issue with productivity and increasing it. And AI is the only solution, the biggest solution, at least, I see right now to make that change.
Maybe to add something here.
Sorry.
Thank you. So I think when we look at the productivity, I totally agree with all what you've said, but if you look really at the productivity gap between Germany and the US, apparently productivity among almost all sectors is completely the same. It's only differentiated through the tech sector. And now we come back to the labor market, because I think that's the major leverage for increasing our productivity. Because, I mean, especially in the venture scene, 9 out of 10 startups are not going to make it. They will fail. And for those reasons, it's more than ever important being capable of laying off people that don't perform and hiring the best people we can get. So I think when we look at the entire comparison between the US and Germany, it's only coming down to the tech sector and then to the flexibility in the market, meaning hiring the right people at the right time and also getting rid of the people if they are not the right fit. So this is one of the major opportunities to make young companies efficient and also to increase the productivity gap and make sure, or not increase the gap, but increasing the productivity in comparison. The other point I would like to add to your first question was the question for the economically reasonable investment, because we've been talking here a lot about billions, but the truth is, if you look at the next releases of OpenAI and Anthropic and all of them, and I have many friends there, they will cost trillions. So we are talking about the wrong dimension here, just to make this very clear, yeah? And what is OpenAI burning a year? 50 billion, around this? Just a guess?
Around 40.
So, and we are talking here about subsidies of 20 billion compared to a company burning 50 billion a year. So I just think we have to be very clear on what we put into especially the large language models in comparison to what we get out of them. I'm totally fine, with all the investments, and I know we need this very deeply, but I think it's important also to make sure we understand what it means to really build performative models. And this won't be working with 20 billion subsidies and also not with a little bit of pension funds and a little bit of investment here and there. So it's much larger dimension we must think about.
Would German large language models be, or European, would this be part of a strategic agenda which we need to have? Or
Can I dwell on this labor productivity, because I think you hit it really well. Reduction of 20% headcount gets you to a negative 5% on personnel cost. Everything has been eaten up. So the old model of onshore, nearshore, offshore is dead. We have to have a new model, and this is where AI comes into play. It's onshore automate.
Yeah.
That's the only way how we increase labor productivity. That's the only way to basically make sure that the competitiveness of the old industry, not on the tech industry, but on the old industry, is staying alive.
And I think that's an interesting one, because people always are still stuck in the software productivity tool paradigm in terms of like we are selling tools to make humans more productive, and that's kind of the measure we're using. But to your point on nearshoring, if you think about nearshoring customer service, it's a $500 billion industry globally. Yeah. If you just take a fraction of that, it's so large that we can essentially just, off the back of that, create huge outcomes in Europe. And so to your point on nearshoring that, it comes down to actually leaning into existing infrastructure that exists, but also continue building our own infrastructure towards that end, such as we have more verticalized value capture, because ultimately that's, to my earlier point, like we're transforming labor into compute, and that labor needs to land in Europe to get the productivity uptake you were just describing.
Just one thought, in the second where we are transforming labor, we of course also need to take the society along, and maybe starting to develop and shape a positive narrative around what AI can do for us as an aging population, what they can do for us. I think would also be an imperative going forward. As we are the Berlin Global Dialogue, it's not just us five having a very intense and super interesting dialogue, but we also have our young voices. I would only know where they are. They are over there. So the young voices are sort of excellent students who have been handpicked, and they sort of sat together and came up with a few questions, and maybe you would like to come up to the microphone to, I think there are 3 of you, to share your questions to us, and we'll give our best to answer them. You might briefly want to introduce yourself, your name and where you're from.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. So I'm Puma from Renmin University of China in Beijing. So I would like to set the questions about the collaboration. You just mentioned a lot about China, US, and Europe. So as far as I know, Europe and Asia are advancing AI from distinct paradigms. Europe emphasizes ethical governance and industrial resilience, while China, maybe Asia and other countries, focus on scale and applied innovation. How can both regions collaborate to develop interoperable and trustworthy AI systems that reinforce shared values and technological sovereignty? This is my question. Thank you.
Any volunteer?
Well, in general, of course, you can discuss this, but first of all, you need to have a proper discussion then. Frankly, if we have the same ethical standards or base when it comes to using AI, I would say that's the start point then, and if you come to a yes, then you can discuss common regulation. But of course, in many areas, what we see right now, there are differences. If it comes to the use of data, for example, accumulation of data, by whom, for what, I would say there are some different approaches. And if we find common ground on that, we can take the next step. But if not, I made some comments on what might the conclusion then.
I think next, Edon.
Yeah, I'm Edon, originally from Albania, currently studying an MBA here at the SMT. Thank you for the panel and the discussion. It's actually really interesting to see how there's so many paths and viewpoints for the same goal. You referred to productivity a lot. My question would be referring productivity and its impact on society. How can we make sure that the productivity gains are translated to broad-based benefits for the whole society, rather than into fiscal and social problems like job displacements, lower tax revenues from job displacements, less contribution means to healthcare and pension systems. So basically, how can we make sure that it doesn't evolve into a K economy?
I mean, that is kind of precisely what we believe, what I said by saying we need to nearshore the productivity gains in Europe that are emerging here. And so that comes down to making sure that the companies that are getting built are getting taxed in Europe, and that the compute that is being used is being taxed in Europe. And to your point on like how do we equalize that, and the discussion we had earlier, I'm happy we're living in a social market economy. And I feel like once these tax gains are captured here, then I'm leaning on government officials like Jens to make sure that these are actually cascaded in a way that makes sure we don't leave people behind. I think that's the first point. It's really, and I think it's an important one because digitization took 15 years. AI will go so much faster that we need to be having a really prepared mind and act with urgency in making sure that the productivity gains are being locked now. And I think the government is actually doing a really good job at this right now. And I think they're getting too much negativity and too much bashing and not enough recognition for what they're doing. And I do think we need to support you guys more. No, I do feel that because this is ultimately going to put our democracy at risk. If we don't lean on making sure we don't leave people behind, we will end in civil war. And to be honest, I love the US. I don't want to be living there. Have you ever visited the central US? Like there's no fiber, there's no services. People are completely living almost in the dark ages. I don't see that in Europe. I see European people living almost too well, but there is a way where we're saying we tax revenue here, and then we make sure that gets distributed in a way that everybody participates, one. And then in the long term, we need to lean into reskilling and upskilling. It's going to be one of the most major shifts, because if you really take AI and think it 20 years out, we will have automated cognition, and we will have automated physical labor. So what's going to be left? I think that's a philosophical question, but there's a pathway to designing the trajectory until we land there, and I think that pathway needs to be established now.
If I just, thank you, might add something. I would say for an aging society like ours, and actually most European society, China is aging on a very quickly. This is actually a chance rather than a risk when it comes to jobs. Because, in all services, yes, we have lost jobs in the industry sector, but that has certain reasons that need to be addressed. But if it comes to services, there's still shortages everywhere, actually. We have, 150 people right now in Germany working for call centers. Sooner or later, I would say, sooner, that will be gone, but still we can use all of them in other areas of services. So I would say AI for an aging society on that level of security, social security standards. That is, our pension system, our healthcare system, our elderly care system needs big productivity increases. Otherwise, it can't work. If someone is believing in Germany or in Europe, you can fix this by reforms in the system, by saving billions. That's not going to happen. Sometimes I wonder about some discussions here in Germany with an aging society. Of course, you can become more efficient here and there, but in general, you will need much more money. And that means you need to have growth. And growth with less younger people means you need to have big increases of productivity. So I would say for an aging society like us, it's not a risk. It's the only chance almost.
Yeah, and interesting if you compare that to India, by the way, right? India has probably the largest demographic of young people now hitting the labor market over the next 5 years, and these are mainly in IT services. I personally don't know what these people are going to do. And that's the problem. So they have more urgency to act there. I think our urgency is invert. We need to make sure that the scarcity in people we have right now actually adds up to GDP growth. Yeah.
Thomas Freund.
Thank you very much for all the passionate discussion you guys just had. My name is Thomas. I'm from Brazil originally, and I study here at ESMT. And I have lived in Europe for the last 5 years. And in these 5 years, I have come to really appreciate and be proud of the EU project. And I think it's one of the least appreciated, if not the most underappreciated projects of the 20th century. And one thing that makes me really appreciate this is the principles that it tackles issues with that a lot of other regions in the world will often ignore. But this appreciation is also why in the last couple of years I've been very frustrated by seeing Europe fall behind, see Europe be defanged at a time when it needs to have its own voice, be so dependent at a time when it needs to stand up for itself, and see, now with regulations, small companies, new SMEs and startups be choked by the regulations, larger companies as well be limited. So my question is really, when it comes to especially the AI Act, but other regulations, what do you think are the most important things that we should be bulldozing yesterday? And what are the principles which we should not forget about in this process? Like, what are the principles that the EU holds that we should not lose sight of in the process?
Look, let me start. I think we shouldn't hide away from regulation, but on the other hand, we shouldn't use regulation as the fundamental argument why we're not moving. I think what we're doing here in Europe is we should change the ratio between talking and doing. Just put it upside down, right? And just get started. And what we are discussing in our company is create a problem. Show me your problem, then we can see whether we can resolve that problem or whether we have to stop that project. Rather than to see, before you start a race, I can't do this because there's regulation staying in my way. I think this is the attitude we train. We have to become a doer mentality rather than a talker mentality. And I think people are shying away from regulation, they're shying away from GDPR and all this stuff. And yes, there's work to be done, but this is not the main hindering reason why you shouldn't move ahead.
Folks like you should just go start companies and build, and then go speak to him to make sure all this gets fixed.
But I want I mean, in general, the problem of the last years, perhaps, especially for Germany, but perhaps for the whole of Europe. I don't know if I can put that correctly in English, but if for too long everything goes very well, you might think this goes on forever, and you put one regulation after the other, and it's still growing, still doing well, and you introduce a minimum wage, and it's still doing well. Everyone said it's going down, but it's still going up. But at a certain point, then the burden is too heavy, and especially if then geo-economics are changing as well. And that is, in my back home, they'd say, nach Fest kommt ab. What is that in English? If you overdo it, you break it. And that is what we have done with regulation in Europe, especially. When it comes to CS DDD, the minister from Saudi Arabia said earlier here, it's in Germany, they tell him it's CS DDD. When it comes to AI Act, when it comes to taxonomy, when it comes to all of this has its good reasons, but all together is just blocking us, and it's just too much of red tape. So actually in Brussels, finally, we do have majorities to get a turn. I would say we would need a bigger and quicker turn and get rid of some of that stuff. At least it's postponed and at least it's downsized. But even if you take away all the regulation of the past 5 years, I can guarantee you there's still enough regulation left from the past 50 years that make sure that we meet our ethical standards, no doubt about that.
Very good. I think Ursula von der Leyen will be here tomorrow. Maybe we'll leave a little note on the table, which she can then read and take home. Now, we are coming to the close, but before we jump to the lunch buffet, I want to do a Schnellraterunde, one sentence. If you can envision reading one headline in the Financial Times on AI in Europe in 2035, what would you like to read?
Europe has made it.
I think maybe we haven't talked so much about all the AGI topics, but I think sooner or later, maybe a little bit later, we will achieve this. And considering we achieved this one day, then I would be so fascinated, and I'm a little bit excited about this actually, how much we could actually have human intelligence being coded towards data that still enrich AGI. because otherwise we will only live from fantastic data, which is not so sexy. So I would love to see this happening in Europe.
Thank you.
I would say Europe has become a doer culture again.
I would say Europe has 3 out of the 10 largest global technology companies.
Or perhaps in 10 years, Berlin Global Dialogue 25 was the starting point.
Very good. So let's hope Europe will make it. Thank you very much for the inspiration, the imperatives we formulated, and looking forward to continuing the debate. Danke.
Thank you.